Good morning, good afternoon, all. Welcome to the Atlantic Council virtually. My name is Rebecca Shire, and I'm calling in from Colorado. It's very nice to connect with you from all your respective corners of the world. On behalf of the Adrienne Arsh Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center and our partner, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all the participants, the panelists, and particularly Kelly, Walter, and Mark. Thank you for joining us in recognition of our World Refugee Day. I'd like to start off the event by saying a few words about context here, mainly that we are witness to the greatest migration in human history, where millions of people daily fight for survival, safe refuge, and a path to a better future. Refugees are driven from their homes by conflict, other forms of violence, and persecution, and often face compounding risks like hazards such as climate-fueled major disasters and the more subtle yet profound impacts of climate change, like sea level rise and extreme heat. All of these risks, of course, are now exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we need to be thinking about how this pandemic, like major disasters, has disproportionate impact on uprooted individuals, families, women, children, unaccompanied minors, the extreme poor, and other segments of society that are disenfranchised based on gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and many other distinctions among us. So the question underpinning our dialogue today is really, what can we do better? What can we do differently to reduce risk and foster refugee resilience? Collective influence, our privilege, and our compassion, we can augment what we are doing now to extend greater opportunity to vulnerable refugees and others displaced. Our Adrienne Arsh Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council has set a goal of reaching 1 billion people with resilient solutions to climate change, migration, and related human security challenges. Through partnerships and a multi-sectoral approach, we scale evidence-based solutions for lasting impacts, measured by a durable transfer of skills, knowledge, and other layers of protection for individuals and communities. Over the course of the next hour, we will engage in a dialogue with some of the best experts in the field of humanitarian assistance, familiar faces to many of you. Walter, Kelly, and Mark have dedicated much of their careers to protecting and improving the lives of the most at-risk people on our planet. This event also marks the launch of our new Humanitarian Dialogue series, co-created with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And this series will include podcasts and virtual webinars and other efforts that help raise awareness and push for collective action in support of refugees, migrants, and internally displaced. Importantly, this includes changing the narrative around migration, putting more of a positive light on what's happening in the world. Here, focusing on refugees, when they're unable to return to their places of origin, we really need to recognize their enormous potential as inherent, valuable, and innovative contributors to local economies, to culture, and all facets of society. Finally, I would like to thank our center's founder and executive vice chair at the Atlantic Council, Adrienne Arsh, for her vision and creation of our center, and the Rockefeller Foundation for their essential support to our work and our mutual commitment in helping vulnerable people around the world. With that, it's a pleasure to introduce Rena Ninan, who graciously offered to moderate this event. Rena comes to us with considerable journalism experience that has taken her through the Middle East and Asia, where she has reported on refugee and other humanitarian issues. So thank you all again for joining, and thank you, Rena.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to moderate this discussion on World Refugee Day. And as a journalist, there's so much, as everyone knows, in the news, and to be able to have this platform to discuss this. And as I mentioned, things percolating in the news just minutes ago, the Supreme Court announced that President Trump cannot end DACA. It was a 5-4 ruling. I liked what you said, Rebecca, in your opening remarks, how this is really a fight for survival when you talk about the situation with refugees and people across the world. So without further ado, I want to announce our panel here. And let them give you a sense of what they're looking at from their vantage point. And I want to give you a sense at home or your home offices where you're coming from today about what today will look like. We're going to allow them to have their opening statements. We're going to have a little discussion with them, and then we're going to open up for some Q&A from all of you. You have a chance to participate. There's a Q&A button there, as many of you are familiar with Zoom, and we'd love for you at any point to enter those questions in. So without further ado, I want to introduce Kelly. Kelly Clements is the Deputy High Commissioner with United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Kelly, I'd love for you to start us off.
Thanks very much, Rena, and thanks to the Atlantic Council and the Arsht Rockefeller Resilience Center. This is a really tremendous opportunity and perfect timing. Quite literally, 2 days before World Refugee Day, which we will recognize on Saturday. Today, we launched, Rena, the Global Trends Report, which is the precursor to Refugee Day, to look at forced displacement in the world today. And what we have found at the end of 2019 is that 1% of humanity, 1%, single digit, enormous impact, 1% is displaced, either refugees or internally displaced, people on the move, in terms of fleeing, as Rebecca said, from war, persecution, conflict, and other means. We have some almost 80 million people right now that are in all corners of the earth trying to rebuild their lives, trying to save their families, trying to put their kids in school, trying to find ways to be able to support themselves. We have seen over the last decade 100 million people that have been displaced, 45 million internally displaced this year, and about 30 million refugees. Now, these people come from 5 countries primarily, about 2/3 of them, from Syria, from Afghanistan, from South Sudan, from Venezuela, from Myanmar. And so what we are really seeing is, if there is political will to solve some of the world's toughest problems, there can be solutions for refugees and for other people that are displaced. What we're also seeing, Rena, is that this is a population that is increasingly on the younger side. Refugees tend to be younger than those in the normal population. Only 4% are over the age of 60. 40% are under the age of 18. So of course, these are people with enormous potential to rebuild their lives and rebuild their home communities, should they have the chance to be able to go home. We know that there is much that we need to be doing in order for them to be able to find homes and to be able to rebuild and to prepare for the future. Displacement is more widespread, and even now in the times of COVID-19, of the coronavirus, displacement hasn't stopped, war hasn't stopped, despite the call from the Secretary General for a ceasefire. War and conflict continues in some locations on the planet, which means more people are displaced and fleeing for their lives. Some things we know: this is not temporary. Many people have been displaced for not just years, but decades and generations. That we need solutions, as Rebecca said at the top, of resilience in terms of the tools that people have to rebuild their own lives becomes increasingly important. We need new and more accepting attitudes on the part of the international community, of communities in towns around the globe, but we also know that there is an enormous amount of outpouring of support for people that are displaced, and we see that now during the times of the coronavirus. But really, if you see that we can solve some of the world's toughest conflicts, we make it possible for people to go home and in the meantime be able to provide for themselves. Now, the coronavirus, if I can just say, Rena, before we go to some of your other questions, the coronavirus has been blind to borders. It has not distinguished between those that are citizens of a country and those that may be temporarily in those host communities. So it is a global pandemic. We need to be able to support the weakest among, and we have seen that those that are marginalized, and that does tend to be refugees and displaced people, we know that one will then not protect the rest of us. So we need to protect the weakest amongst us in order to make us all strong. We know also that this is not something that just affects people in rural areas. Urban areas are heavily hit in terms of the coronavirus, and war zones are not immune from COVID-19. So really, in terms of being able to strengthen all of us, and we'll get to this resilience topic, strengthening health systems locally as well as nationally and from a global level is absolutely essential to be able to protect, aid, and establish some resilience in terms of displacement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Boy, it was fascinating to hear just how the young are really impacted as refugees. I want to get more into that in a bit. I want to turn to Walter Cote, who's the regional director for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in America. Walter.
Thank you, Rina. Big pleasure to be with you today. First of all, I would like to give my big salutation to the migrants, to the refugees, to the IDPs in the world. We are existing because then we are trying to help them. Also, big salutation to the people that is helping them and trying to do things in concrete way to protect their dignity, their lives, and also their rights to have access to the countries in different ways that are really predicted by different regulations. For us, the main things that we want to really pay attention in the Federation network that is acting in 192 national societies with the same number of countries, and in Americas in 35, is to really do something that allow us to control and to reduce the bad impact of the ignorance that this thematic is comporting in the real life of people. There is a lot of ignorance, a lot of indifference about these matters, and also no action, paralysis by analysis, and fear that is converted in exclusion for this kind of people suffering a lot in sometimes aggregated situations of suffering when they are at the same time migrants or refugees, excluded because COVID, excluded because there is not enough resources in the health systems in the country, triple or quadruple exclusion sometimes for them. Politicization is a big matter for us too. We need to really create a neutral support for people at risk and people on the move in different countries. Our way of work is really be focused on solutions, creating networks of collaboration. We have been blessed by the good collaboration with UN family, especially with UNHCR. We have very good results in many countries that has been mentioned by Kelly, including Syria and South Sudan, and here in the region in Venezuela. And I think we need to continue doing that. We need to serve as pioneers, as actors of creating this kind of sense of collective responsibility about migrants and refugees and people on the move, asylum seekers, IDPs, that in our region is very complicated matter because in some ways it's a forgotten crisis, it's a forgotten disaster, and sometimes it's hiding for different reasons. The priorities for us are, of course, to have campaigns and actions that inform well the communities, inform well the public opinion, like this kind of program that we really welcome a lot, and we celebrate our connection and our good collaboration and partnership with Adrian Harsh, Rockefeller Foundation, and Atlantic Council. We are obliged to be partners forever now because we agree on that, and also with UNHCR. I would like also to highlight as a priority, on top of the information and the awareness for community, the creation of the network of good players and good practitioners, and then increasing resources to protect human beings suffering because the reason of migration or expulsion of IDPs in countries that are forced to leave due the lack of dignity on the treatment or lack of capacities to protect the livelihoods. These kind of things are in our hearts, and we are dealing with that all the time through the volunteers. The last point that I want to mention is we need to recover, we need to recreate the solidarity. Neutral solidarity is very important. Neutral solidarity is a network of good actions, protecting people in real way from our families, from our communities, from our systems, from the public, private, and civil society sectors, academy, and media. We all need to do something for them. Today is only one day in we recall some of them, but we need to play each day of each month of each year in favor of putting them in the right place as a human beings with the same level of rights to be able to live in a normal way. Over to you, Rina. Thank you very much.
Walter, thank you so very much. We look forward to chatting more about all that. I want to bring in as well Mark Bertolini, who's the founding director of Climate and Humanitarian Crisis Initiative. Mark?
Thanks, Rina, and thanks to the Adrian Arch Center for not only hosting this event, but for all the work they're doing in this sphere. It's really critical. So I thought I would just provide a little context from my point of view of where we're at. And I think we're at the early stages of perhaps the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. And I would describe the two most fundamental perils as being the COVID-19 crisis, both its primary threat and its secondary threat, as well as climate change. And again, in climate change, we're talking about short and long-term implications. So, and there's a lot to learn from COVID, I think, that can help us better manage the climate change crisis, which I'll briefly discuss. But just getting back to COVID, refugees, unfortunately, in both cases, are really at the tip of the sphere in terms of being the most vulnerable populations, refugees and migrants. And people who've spent a lot of time in refugee camps know they're crowded. It's virtually impossible to social distance. As Kelly mentioned, the population is primarily young, but there are elderly people also in these camps, and it's impossible to isolate them typically. And with young people, we really don't know yet the implications on vulnerable populations, people that have maybe malnutrition issues, other pre-existing conditions related to the context of which they fled, how the virus will impact younger people. We're starting to see signs that it's actually impacting younger people more significantly in these populations. And then in addition to the context of a refugee camp that they're facing, you're looking at essentially a global breakdown of the world supply chain. And there's necessary supplies for people to help, for PPE, for other essential items are almost impossible to get into many of these places right now. So that's adding to the difficulty of managing this crisis. And who would have thought that we would have situations where aid workers really can't fly now, or they've been quarantined in their homes and unable to get to some of these places. So all these factors are adding to the short-term problems. On the longer-term problems with COVID, the secondary problems, we're going to see continued economic damage from this crisis globally. And again, that will impact largely some of the most vulnerable countries, and it will filter down to refugee camps. There's going to be donor fatigue on the part of donors whose economies are suffering. UNHCR is having significant appeals for COVID now, and I think it's going to be more and more difficult to fund those appeals. So it's something that I think everyone needs to pay attention to in terms of trying to help these populations. And the World Food Program has cited extreme food security issues coming. There was even discussion of possibly multiple famines. Hopefully it won't come to that level, but certainly we're going to see significant issues on that front, both because of supply chain issues and again, crashing economies, crashing and geopolitical issues as the impacts of this crisis leave their mark there as well. So it's really a challenging time. On climate change, the parallels between COVID and climate change that I mentioned earlier are really striking. It was never a question that a virus like COVID would come along in the disaster response world. It was only a question of when. And when you look at sort of the decision-making that went on in the international community about what threats to prioritize, we spend about $200 billion a year on terrorism, which I'm not discounting the importance of that threat. But we spent a few $2 or $3 billion a year on pandemic response. Yet we knew from SARS, MERS, AIDS, H1N1, and of course the 1918 flu, how devastating to economies and to populations a crisis like this could be. And we knew it was going to be inevitable. Yet, not only did we not, even though we did a lot to prepare, it wasn't adequate, and the systems that were built have, in many cases, failed. They just not met the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And with climate change, of course, you have some of the same denial that accompanied COVID. And then we have, again, a lack of urgency in terms of looking at both the short-term and long-term impacts. there is no vaccine for climate change. It's going to have generational impacts, and it's going to become increasingly worse. So one of the things the center that I'm working with, that we're doing, and we're trying to do it collectively with the entire response community, is looking at better understanding the threat so that we can more effectively look at the systems to make sure the systems are resilient enough to respond as effectively as possible. And the challenge going forward in terms of storms, of droughts, of desertification, of disease transmission, which we know will change with climate change. I mean, the list is incredibly long. And again, it's refugees and migrants who are going to be at the point of the spear in terms of suffering the consequences of these crises. So it's challenging times, but I look forward to the dialogue today and looking at ways that we can better prepare ourselves for this and to the extent possible mitigate these consequences.
Mark, thank you very much. I want to get started into our Q&A and just want to remind everyone we're welcoming your questions as well. If you're not familiar, you can submit your questions. If you just hover over the window at the bottom of the menu, there's a Q&A button there, which will open up and you can submit your questions at any time. Kelly, you know, it's so fascinating that your Global Trends report came out today. And I was just curious, when you look at this, the trends that you are seeing, Kelly, what worries you the most?
Oh gosh, the list, Rena, is quite long, I have to say. There are a few things, and Mark and Walter both mentioned this, but in terms of what we worry about, what some of the risks may be, and maybe to talk about the pandemic, which of course, when we closed the books on the statistics for 2019, was barely something that the world was focused on as they are now, because it has touched literally every corner of the globe. The risks are many when it comes to displacement. So for example, in the current situation, Rena, we have, in terms of protection, some serious concerns that there are walking back, a decreased access when it comes to the ability for people to be able to seek asylum, to be able to cross borders, to be able to really exercise their rights. Now there's it's understandable that countries want to be able to protect from a health perspective their countries, their communities, and so on. But we think very much that you can have a system in place to respect human rights at the same time that you're taking care of the health of your communities, of your citizens. And what we worry about is that some of the restrictions, the border issues that we have seen become baked into the response of governments going forward, which will make it more difficult for refugees or those seeking refuge to seek asylum in the future. What we have seen, Rena, is that there are 163 countries that either have partially or fully closed their borders during this pandemic, which has, of course, made it impossible in some cases for people fleeing war and conflict to actually seek asylum. 22 countries, we have reports of what we call refoulement, where people have gone to the border and been rejected and had to go back. And who knows, in terms of their lives being in peril. And as I mentioned earlier, conflict continues. So this is a significant risk to see the international protection system break down or somehow weaken during this time of a pandemic. We see, Rena, also increased vulnerabilities of the population. Mark talked, of course, about refugee camps, but the majority of the refugees where we are aiding and in the communities are actually in urban areas. That's why it makes it so important that national health systems, local health systems actually incorporate refugees and displaced in terms of their own response. The increases, as has been pointed out, increase of food costs, for example, and commodities, the loss of jobs and livelihoods, the inability of refugees and displaced to make a living. We've seen, for example, in Iraq that 88% of Iraqi displaced have actually lost their livelihoods. Now, of course, we see most are on the informal sector, and those jobs are going away during times of lockdown and during the pandemic. In Lebanon, we see 78% are having difficulties just buying food to feed their families. In South Africa, 95% of the calls that we get through our call center are from refugees that were previously self-sufficient. So the increase in vulnerability is real. We also see an increase in social tensions. and issues related to stigma, racism, discrimination. We've seen this in 41 countries across the globe. There are issues related to gender-based violence, for example, and people in lockdown being with abusive partners and what this has meant. If you don't have coping mechanisms and ways to be able to support yourself, you find yourself in an exceedingly difficult and dangerous situation, and the coping mechanisms are serious. And then there are the issues that Mark raised in terms of some of the risks and vulnerabilities. These are overcrowded areas, overcrowded camps or urban areas, difficult to socially distance, and so on. So what we're seeing is really emergencies on top of an emergency. It's health, it's humanitarian, it's socioeconomic, and then on top of that, wars, conflicts continue, and even non-COVID related emergencies exacerbate even in this time. So it's a number of risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. You know, Mark, hearing Kelly say that 163 borders have been either partially or fully closed, over the past few months is incredibly alarming. You know, when you see that trend today and countries are closing their borders, given that global trend, how do you move past it? How do you deal with these countries who might be saying, we don't want to bring anybody in?
Well, it's a problem that the community has struggled with in many different crises. And what's interesting, you look at the Kosovo crisis from decades ago, and there was a huge exodus of refugees in a very short period of time, a matter of days. And the international community responded, rather than panicking, they worked collectively to try to address the issue. You had countries throughout the world offering temporary protected status, offering long-term resettlement options. And ultimately, the crisis was resolved in a matter of months, and many of those people were able to return home. So I think it's just a mindset of how can we most effectively deal with this problem. And the idea of closing borders, there is some obviously validity in that in terms of trying to contain the virus. But over the longer term, it's not a productive strategy. And time again, we've seen that globally, that when countries become isolationist, other problems emerge, and it becomes overwhelming for them as well. So it's a difficult issue, but one that is complicated, obviously, by the COVID constraints.
Walter, I want to ask you at this point, you know, we've got COVID, we've got the global recession that everyone's talking about. When you see the situation on the ground in the field, what do you believe, Walter, the priority should be for refugees?
This is very, very big question. We already are doing something on that. But for me, it's a combination of different matters. Of course, we are experiencing at least two different connections with the migrants and with the refugees and with IDPs. One is the mobile service points that we have. That is, at least, for instance, in the case of South America, we have around 60 service points in which we are delivering services on the move for people that is traveling from Venezuela to the south. But also we have other kind of services that are for people that are staying in countries, like 300 points that we are managing in the South America area. This is very big and complicated network of service without resources, without enough support from some of the governments, some of the other sectors. But we are doing our best by using solidarity and creating capacities. Advocacy is very important. Public opinion, well-informed, is very important. And of course, in the other hand, the decisions and the creation of, in one side, the good practice of the current regulatory frameworks that are available in countries and the global ones that protect refugees, migrants, and people on the move. We need to use that more and create some kind of sense of viralization, make all these good practices viral to allow people to understand and to share knowledge. Sharing knowledge is very important in these times, you know, because we need to act in the same way that the virus is acting. The virus is overpassing all the borders. We need to create another type of positive virus that allow us to be connected with people that is ready to serve, ready to create solutions, simple solutions, clear solutions to save lives, to protect human dignity. We are all runners on a big marathon. We are running, as Kelly was saying, in the marathon of health and lack of access of health, lack of access of water and sanitation. This continent, for instance, have 200 million people that have not good services in health and in water sanitation. This continent, Americas. And I think we need to see this as a big marathon that we need to run. The other marathon is the marathon of climate change and climate adaptation. You know, we need to really be cautious because in this region, for instance, we have streams on heat waves and also cool waves, and a lot of affectation in the normal lives of people living in islands and people living in the coastal areas. And then the other marathon is about migrants, the migration, the exclusion. This is happening before COVID-19. Over these three routes of the marathon, we have a big mega storm that is COVID-19. And now we are obliged to create solutions on the middle of that. And the point that we are observing now is we have good space now. We have good space now to create sense of aggregation, amalgamation of efforts, and also integrate practices. And this is the way to proceed. You need to be simple, quick, and really active to save lives and to include more and more migrants, refugees in their own lives. They have the right to manage their life, to be owners of the destiny of them. And we need to protect that. I hope that one day we will see all these migrants and IDPs like normal, anonymous persons with the same level of right that people believe and deserve. And this is the way that the Red Cross is taking this action on place with, as I say, creating this sense of networking, collaboration with good colleagues and good people like you in this call and others that are really serving a lot to the human beings. Over to you, Rina. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. It's very powerful to hear you say, which probably is not echoed enough in the refugee community, that they have the right to be owners of their own destiny. That's very powerful. Mark, you know, in your opening statement, Mark, you said that you believe we are in the early stages of one of the worst humanitarian crises since World War II. Tell me a little bit more about that, and how do you think COVID is impacting the global approach to helping refugees?
Well, as I mentioned, COVID is creating challenges that we really couldn't have expected. You know, we've had a number of epidemics and pandemics over the last 20 years, and they were all very serious in their own way, but nothing has been as global at the scale of what we're facing with COVID and as highly transmissible as COVID. And so the idea, again, that aid workers are having difficulty moving around, that countries are hoarding supplies for their own populations, which is, you know, understandable, but at the same time having devastating impacts on the most vulnerable communities and on the ability to effectively assist them with COVID. So it's really adding incredible difficulties. But I also want to say, and it sort of goes to what Walter was saying, that amidst all this really challenging dynamics we're facing, you can't not help but see what's going on around us globally as well, in terms of people begging pots, howling at certain hours in support of health workers, grocery store employees, others who are helping us pull us through this crisis. Looking at the protests that are going on right now for racial justice. I mean, it's in order to ultimately, again, this is a short and a long-term problem. And in order to address the longer term aspects of this, it's all about connecting with other people's humanity, with migrants and refugees. And so at a time when we're really facing desperate things, we're also seeing some signs of hope. So I think there's that to look forward to as well.
That's great. That's really great to hear that you are still hopeful. Kelly, I want to ask you, when you look around sort of at the scale of all of this, ultimately refugees want to return home. Many of them do, even if they likely won't be able to. What do you see as possible solutions in the era that we live in right now, with governments closing their borders? What are you hopeful about, and where do you think we can sort of make the most progress?
Thanks for the question, because I actually, both Mark and Walter coming back on this issue of the optimistic view. I mean, Walter said something very powerful in his opening about solidarity. And Mark just mentioned in terms of how much people are really wanting to provide support, empower, find solutions. And this, I think, you know, is the best of humanity. And obviously that's how we're going to get through this. You know, even in a time of the pandemic, when we think about solutions, we think about a community, and we're part of a much larger community of protection, aid, relief, development actors that are trying to provide some support, including to these 80 million people in their host communities. And largely, even in the last 3 to 4 months, in the height and the peak of the pandemic in some parts of the globe, our teams, our cherished personnel have stayed and they've delivered. Now, at times, have they had to pull back for a bit and do some very unusual aid delivery? Yes, of course they have, but they are staying and delivering, and that is huge testament as well to the humanitarian and development community in terms of wanting to stay very connected to the populations that they're there to serve. The inclusion agenda, and again, Walter mentioned this issue of include. This is fundamental, and the Global Compact on Refugees that was adopted by 193 countries in 2018 very importantly talked about inclusion, and it talked about the importance of self-reliance. It was mentioned by Walter that people want to be able to provide for themselves. They want to see some kind of livelihood. They want their kids to get an education. They don't want to be aid recipients. They want to be drivers of their future. And this is something where clearly our entire system of delivery support, accountability to affected populations, how we provide the tools to be able to allow that to happen, from employment to increased education opportunities. And we're seeing this even in the midst of a pandemic, the possibilities. Where we worry is that socioeconomic piece that we've been talking about, the loss of jobs globally, the collapse of some economies, reduction of GDP, et cetera. But that's something we need to watch. But the inclusion agenda and making sure that displaced are part of the national systems, public health, water, labor, finance, you name it, that displaced are part of the planning process, they're part of the delivery model. This is key. And then we see, Rena, the partnership piece, which is so critical. Mark talked about the average citizen, but you see people and entities and funding mechanisms that are sprouting out now in the face of the pandemic that we haven't seen before, or tools that have been designed that will allow us to really take our emergency relief further in terms of the development side and long term, and the international financial institutions and what they've said and how they're going to provide. The World Bank fast-tracking $14 billion, for example. ADB putting $20.5 million into the Sahel just in the last week or so through UNHCR. The EU looking at $15.6 billion in support. And the US continuing to be the largest supporter of humanitarian aid to many organizations, including my own, in terms of this response to COVID, but importantly to other humanitarian emergencies around the globe. And this is critically important. So I do see that there is room for solutions, but it's going to come with inclusion, it's going to come with empowerment, it's going to come with a much broader array of partnerships than we've ever seen before. Over.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I want to turn to viewer questions, but Mark, I know you wanted to weigh in right before we do. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add to something that Kelly referenced earlier, and that is we have to look at root causes in some of these crises as well. And Syria has the largest, by far, refugee crisis, is posing the largest refugee crisis in the world, with about 6.7 million refugees and almost an equally number of internally displaced people. Hopefully that long nightmare of a war is coming to an end. And it's an opportunity for the international community to work collaboratively. The country, in many parts of it, are in ruins. The economy is in ruins. Donors will have a lot of sway in trying to create conditions. There's a new constitutional process that will be undergoing, and create conditions where refugees can go home in safety and have some belief that they'll be secure when they go home, which they don't have right now. So there's an opportunity there, and just resolving that would significantly reduce the global strain on supporting those populations by the host countries. And of course, that applies to virtually everything we're talking about, to try to look at root causes in climate change, but also some of these global security challenges that we're facing.
Thank you, Mark. I want to take a viewer question from Kavita Tomlinson, who's asking, Walter, maybe you can take this question. What's being done to ensure safe migratory pathways for refugees, thinking specifically of South America, Central America refugees trying to come to the US?
This is another very complicated question because the people is, living from very bad situations, trying to escape from the big level of risk. And they use different routes. But by now, we have two routes in the continent. One is going to the south and the other one is going to the north. And the difference are, very variety, but we need to see how to deal with that. And I see big tendencies now to have people returning home, forced to return, passing through very, very difficult and risky paths and routes. And this is augmenting the level of risk for people. In general terms, we see as a federation, as a network of Red Cross and Red Crescent, the problem of the recognition of the volume and the risk of people, especially in the borders of Mexico and United States, and also in the borders of the Triangle of the North in Guatemala, Salvador, and Honduras. We have big situations there in which we need a lot of resources, a lot of capacities to protect human beings at risk in these borders. And we have the same thing happening now between Panama and Colombia and some other problems in the chain of countries that we have in the south. And on that, I think we need to really optimize the information, the mapping of the risk, the mapping of solutions that we have. And as was mentioned by Kelly and Mark, I think we need to really be focused on possibilities and opportunities to increase the power of our advocacy, the power of our action, the power of our good practices, and creating double ways to support the migrants. One is the urgent way that is, composed by health matters, psychosocial support, protection, orientation, and optimizing the way that they are living on the move. This is one thing. But the other thing that is the real solution is optimizing the livelihoods, optimizing the way that they are included in countries and being able to have some income and some possibilities to become normal again. And this is happening in all the borders, in the borders of the North, in the borders of the Central America, in the borders of the South. And we are all to be focused on protecting the route, the people when they are in the route, and also in the places in which they are arriving. Welcoming people, embracing people, and trying them as a human beings is very important, and including them as a members of the civil society in each country. Migrants are a treasure. Migrants are a real value to improve, accelerate the culture, the economy, and the possibilities of any culture, any country. We need to embrace that more and avoid the fear, avoid the stigmatization, the xenophobia from them. We need to really believe that they are, like us, normal human beings that deserve the same thing that we deserve. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Walter. Kelly, this next question's for you. UNHCR has applied what's known as a graduation approach to ultra poverty to refugees through its relationship with Trickle Up. Is it working?
That's a big question. I have to say it's a good segue to the last question, and it's regarding current impacts right now in terms of the pandemic. But what we've seen also in terms of some of the socioeconomic data, that together with the World Bank, we've really intensified efforts over the last year to 2 years. And I think we have managed to use both the data that the bank has on host communities with some of the refugee data that we share to look at really what some of the impacts of some of these programs are. And it was based on the early work done on this graduation model that the viewer's question relates to. And we did apply this, I believe it was in 5 or 6 different countries. Costa Rica comes to mind as one that successfully used the graduation model in terms of seeing a way to move past going towards self-reliance, a way to graduate from some of the aid provision. So yes, but I do think we've taken a few steps back, of course, in the last couple of years, and now with this year with regard to the pandemic. Case in point, one of the things, and Mark had mentioned financial issues, and when we came out with our first COVID-related appeal, we ended up putting a substantial piece of that appeal, not just into procurement, to try to make sure that we have protect the people that are aiding, but also the populations that we're serving. But cash became a big issue, because what we found is that without livelihoods, people were running out of resources, which meant that in some of the locations that I mentioned earlier, we have seen the poverty rates and the extreme poverty rates really jump in just a period of 2 to 3 months. We've also seen, if we go a little further south of Walter's comments about Central America to the Venezuela situation, we have seen in the last few weeks 30 to 50,000 Venezuelans going home out of desperation. They don't have a way to support their families. They're sleeping on the streets. The host communities are, even though exceptionally generous, having difficulty being able to provide. And without the jobs and without the services, it has been difficult for those individuals to find the kind of refuge and livelihoods that they would need, as much as Colombia and Ecuador and other hosts are doing. So the impact of seeing the reduction in livelihoods, the loss of jobs, and to see how that impacts mobility is quite an interesting phenomenon, because I'm not sure that would be the initial inclination of some of those that we see returning, is to return, but they see no other option at the moment.
You know, Mark, you mentioned about donor fatigue. It's so important trying to get people into jobs, moving people on. The one question we have for you is there a role for micro insurance to protect the most vulnerable to disasters like droughts, hurricanes, et cetera?
Absolutely. And it's something that it raises a larger issue, but in terms of insurance, it's something that the climate change discussions have certainly been under discussion there. And the Adrian R. Center, I know, is working on a project with insurance as well. But it brings up the larger issue of there's that great scene in the movie Jaws where the scientist sees the shark and says, we're going to need a bigger boat. And that's the situation we're in the humanitarian community right now with the scale of what we're facing. And the private sector, it's time for the private sector to more significantly engage. Not just the private sector, but they're going to be one of the keys. And I think they've largely viewed their role as continuity of operations, looking at maintaining the safety of their staff, their core business. And now I think they're already moving toward looking at more broad views of protecting markets. And there's a role for them here, absolutely. And we're going to need them. And not just the private sector. In our community, we're doing so much more on climate change just in the last 2 years. To be able to work collaboratively to make sure our various efforts are additive. There's a huge role for innovation and for looking at new ways, new actors to come in, new ways to fund these responses.
Mark, are there examples in the private sector that you think are examples of how this can really be done, of people taking this and really moving with it and making it something sustainable?
Well, there's examples of why it needs to be done. And there are examples. There's, Walmart in the crisis in the US and Katrina played a critical role in logistics and opening up stores. But you have examples of several years ago, there was massive flooding in Thailand. And it turns out that much of the semiconductor industry had their hard drive production in this one small area. And there was a realization that with globalization, there has to be a new way of thinking about how businesses not only have to, again, protect their own core assets, but more broadly, the global market and their manufacturing bases, because these problems are going to be ubiquitous everywhere. So the private sector, I think, is realizing this, and we're seeing them more and more moving in the direction of working with organizations to try to limit their threat, limit their exposure.
Walter, I have a question from the audience from Corey, who wants to ask you, what do you suggest? This is actually for everyone, but Walter, I'll have you take this. What do you suggest for young college grads who want to work in this field, but COVID limits opportunities?
Yeah, no, I think the question of COVID is the main question of today. We are all overstressed by COVID. We are overwhelmed by COVID. We are overcharged by COVID. But we need to maintain positiveness. We need to maintain a strong capacity to be alive and to be functional and active. And my suggestion is let's take COVID like a big mega storm happening during our normal lives and running our marathons. We need to still work. And we are, for instance, in the Red Cross, trapped in the situation in which at least 60% of our workforce is trapped at home because we need to keep them protected at home. Then we have the rest of people is in the front line. And for me, the question is we need to protect at the same time the people that is really suffering out there in the streets, migrants, IDPs. This is the main concern for us. And we need to create creative solutions, be with them, try to help them by using them to be the helpers. We need to really create kind of sense of, let's say, something like delegation of actions, working with them, for them, and through them all the time with the people suffering. But then we need also, the second point is we need to protect our own people in the front line. This is a big issue, and I am commenting on the point that was mentioned by Mark. You know, the insurance is a big problem here because in one side you have people that is making good analysis and good position to ensure actions related with climate change in the future. But pandemics have not insurance, and people in the front line have not insurance. And we are suffering with that now because we have a lot of problems to protect our own people, volunteers, especially in the front line. And is that the reason why I strongly believe that one of the solutions is, let's be simple, creating small cells of action in very local settings, using community solidarity in a normal way, and aggregating all this to be able to create a network of good practitioners that help people in the ground and also make the network really useful for all, learning from all. Our role as a global entities is to share with them the knowledge, share with them the good practices, make their lives more easy to manage and give to them some resources that are scarce, but we can do more on that. And we need to explore, resources like water in the desert. This is the action that we are doing now. We are doing that all the time, and it's time to be more creative. Digitalization, this type of connectivity is something that is proved. This program is proving that we are not contained by the COVID-19. We are able to do the things. We are able to deliver messages. We are able to do programs and operations despite all this. But we need to protect more the people at risk and our own people, the people that help people. We need to protect both in order to create some kind of possible vision for the future and better solutions.
That's great. Especially jobs. I love what the founder of Chobani Yogurt said, that, the moment you give a refugee a job, they stop being a refugee, that the impact of the things that everybody can do on a global scale that can make such a difference. We're going to have to wrap it up in just a couple minutes, but I wanted to do a quick lightning round. If you guys could give me a quick answer on this, I wanted to end on sort of a note of optimism. I know the hard work you guys do can't always be easy, and it can be a little bit depressing, but what do you want the global community to recognize for refugees on World Refugee Day? What do you want the world to know about the resilience of refugees? Walter, why don't we start with you?
For me, resilience is the way to be able to own your destiny. When one person is capable to pay the invoices, he is resilient, he or she is resilient. And if we allow this happen, we are doing the job. We are giving them the possibility to manage their own life and to own their destiny. For me, this is the dream, and this is the action, and this is the goal. This is the way that we think in the Red Cross.
Kelly?
Well, for us, we really can't find solutions if we leave people out, whether or not that's combating a pandemic or if it's addressing forced displacement at its roots. People need to be involved. And refugees, the internally displaced, can be part of the solution. They are not passive recipients. They are active agents in their own futures. And I think just in a follow-up to the last conversation, the comment from Mark on the private sector, we have seen an amazing outpouring from individual givers, but also from business in terms of wanting to see refugees be able to succeed. And that includes on the employment side. So this gives us hope.
Mark?
Well, I'm going to answer that question by telling you a story. Years ago, that's how old I am, I was working in Bosnia for almost 2 years during the war there. And I met a family that had about everything bad that could possibly happen to you happen. The husband had been in a concentration camp. The wife had been injured by a mortar shell in Sarajevo. They had a 2-month-old daughter and a 4-year-old daughter. They had no special characteristics, and they were resettled to the United States solely based on the need of the terrible situation they were in, and they were a mixed marriage couple as well. So today, here we are 20 some odd years later. The 4-year-old has a CPA license, and the parents, I should say, when they came to the United States, they struggled as refugees do, but they worked hard and they put their daughters through college. The 4-year-old is now a CPA at Facebook, and the 2-month-old, this call today, who we're being hosted by Zoom, is a senior executive at Zoom. And
wow.
That's the refugee story. The U.S. did a wonderful thing in bringing them here, and they've done a wonderful thing for this country. And that's replicated throughout the world.
Mark, that is a beautiful story. It brings tears to my eyes. And I think people don't forget the economic impact that refugees also have in every country that they return back. You often see that in incredible numbers. I want to give everyone a chance, though, to wrap up and have some final remarks. Walter, why don't we start with you, then go to Mark, and have Kelly wrap us up.
Thank you. No, my maybe very simple remark is let's pay attention to COVID-19 as an accelerator, as a possibility to become more smart on managing our problems in the world and running the marathons in the middle of the big storm. Then it's important to remain ourselves, creating a network of good practices, like the history of Mark. We need to see how we can inject the interconnectivity among different things. During all these years, I was working in some operations in Africa, in Syria, very much when I was USG of the Federation, and now in the Americas, and I see big space to locate the eyes of migrants and refugees. They always have hope. They always have dignity inside, and we need to protect that. This is the way. We need to protect the dignity of people, and dignity is always there. There is no way to understand that they have no dignity. They have dignity, and we need to protect that. And dignity means to recover all the rights in full spectrum that is expected. And the last thing is we need to protect the helpers. We need to protect the systems, and we need to do this more and more, creating multi-systemic approach by putting together public sector, multilaterals, governments, corporate sector, and civil society organizations in order to play integrated, to optimize the resources, to do the things right in favor of migrants, including them from the very beginning of the relation with them. This is, for me, the kind of the end of the possibility of this action that we are trying to do in the federation and in the region, especially.
Yes.
I appreciate a lot your this opportunity, and over to you, Rina. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've only got a few minutes left, but I want to give Mark a chance as well.
Sure. Well, obviously the challenges we're describing today are immense. But with humanity, with science, with evidence-based programming, I think that's the one benefit of the COVID crisis, is it really is a wake-up call. As bad as it is, it's not going to compare with the generational impacts of climate change. And it's not too late. We have no choice but to address these. And I think there's a lot of smart people out there that have worked on pandemics, and a lot of smart people that are working on climate change related issues. So with engagement, and we're seeing, as I said earlier, more of a passion in terms of global engagement on difficult issues, we can make progress and we can mitigate significantly the impacts of these crises.
Thank you, Mark. Kelly?
So, as was just mentioned, this is enormous challenge, but it's not just a health challenge or displacement challenge. It really does impact all of us. And just like the virus knows no borders, we can't ignore people that are within our midst that need the support to be able to rebuild their lives. So refugees can become part of the solution. And if we can help give them the tools to be able to do so, that they can voice their own futures and be able to map a path forward. But the socioeconomic costs of what's happening right now can't be underestimated. So we need everybody from all parts of society to be able to support this work going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. I think the number that really stands out to me, 80 million people that you said, and the fact that 4%, only 4% are over the age of 60, affecting an incredible generation that we can't ignore. I want to thank all of you for your work, your tireless efforts around the globe, for keeping this forefront. You guys are just remarkable in what you're doing, and the depths of your career in devoting to this. Kelly, Walter, and Mark, I want to thank you. And I also want to thank the Atlantic Council. There's so much news on the forefront, and that they're keeping this issue alive, especially in an important time when this work needs to continue on. Without further ado, I want to thank all of you, and I want to bring back Rebecca.
Thank you, Rena. Really, thank you so much for leading us through a very important dialogue. Kelly, Walter, and Mark, I couldn't say thanks enough. Your time, your insights, your hopeful vision for the future. We truly appreciate your time today in all of this. I'd also like to extend a special thank you again to our founder, Adrienne Arsht, and many thanks again to the Rockefeller Foundation. As mentioned, this kicks off our humanitarian dialogue series. We've set our website, www.1billionresilient.org. And to join the Atlantic Council event, you'll see through our site many opportunities to get engaged. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Take care.